The courtroom was suffocating, thick with tension and the scent of polished wood. Zahara Whitmore sat rigidly at the defense table, her hands clenched in her lap. Her olive-green blazer was perfectly tailored, but that didn't matter. Nothing did. The trial had felt like a cruel performance, and the verdict had been written long before the first gavel strike. Judge Everett Langford, a man with silver hair and sharp, calculating eyes, raised his gavel, his voice carrying a twisted sense of satisfaction. "Ms. Whitmore, this court finds you guilty of corporate fraud and obstruction of justice." A murmur swept through the room. Her attorney tensed. The prosecutor smirked. But Zahara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She shot forward in her seat, her heart hammering. "This is a mistake. I'm innocent." The judge's gavel slammed down. "Enough. I've heard all I need to. The sentence is 10 years in federal prison." 10 years. The weight of those words crushed the air from her lungs. The officer beside her stepped closer, reaching for his cuffs. Her pulse roared in her ears. Panic clawed at her throat. And then, in a desperate impulse, Zahara grabbed her phone and dialed. The courtroom gasped. Langford's eyes flashed with irritation. "Put that away." But the call had already connected. A deep, steady voice answered. "Zahara? What's going on?" The room fell into silence. The officer hesitated. The judge's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough. Zahara inhaled sharply, gripping the phone like a lifeline. "Cassius, they're sentencing me. I need you. Now." A beat of silence. Then, colder than steel, Cassius Hawthorne, Attorney General of the United States, said, "Put the judge on the phone." Color drained from Langford's face. The game had just changed. For the first time since the trial began, Judge Everett Langford hesitated. His fingers clenched the gavel, his knuckles white against the polished wood. The name Cassius Hawthorne wasn't just a name, it was a force. A man who could dismantle careers with a single phone call. And now, that man was demanding to speak with him. The courtroom, once a sea of murmurs and shifting bodies, was now frozen in silence. The prosecutor, who had been smirking moments before, suddenly looked uneasy. The bailiff, ever the enforcer of order, stood still, awaiting his next move. Even the officer who had been ready to cuff Zahara hesitated, his grip on the metal restraints uncertain. Only Zahara remained steady, her breath coming in slow, controlled bursts as she extended the phone toward the judge. "Take it." Langford's jaw clenched. His reputation had been built on dominance, on the ability to twist the law to fit his interests. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned, much less ordered around. But something in the way Zahara held the phone, defiant, unshaken despite the chaos, unnerved him. He snatched the device from her hand, pressing it against his ear with an air of authority. "This is Judge Everett Langford. I don't know who you think you are, but—" Silence. Then, a voice, low, deliberate, razor-sharp. Cassius Hawthorne wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. Whatever he was saying on the other end of that line, it was cutting through Langford like a scalpel. The judge's fingers twitched. His breathing hitched, ever so slightly. His eyes darted around the room, as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. His free hand gripped the bench, the once unshakable pillar of authority visibly rattled. Zahara wished she could hear what was being said. But she didn't need to. She could see it, see the way the balance of power was shifting right before her eyes. The prosecutor was shifting nervously in his seat. The bailiff stole a glance at the officer, uncertain whether to proceed. The jury exchanged confused whispers, sensing the sudden disruption in what was supposed to be a clear-cut sentencing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Langford exhaled sharply. His lips pressed into a tight line. Understood. His voice lacked the arrogance it had carried moments ago. His eyes flicked to Zahara, not with authority, but with something colder. Resentment. He lowered the phone, holding it for a second too long before extending it back to her. Then, clearing his throat, he turned to the courtroom. Due to new legal circumstances, this court will recess before sentencing. The verdict will be reviewed. A collective gasp spread through the room, followed by frantic murmurs. The officer near Zahara took a full step back, no longer reaching for his cuffs. Zahara gripped the phone, her heart still racing, but now for an entirely different reason. Cassius wasn't just protecting her. He was about to dismantle everyone who had put her in that seat. And Judge Langford knew it. This wasn't over. Not even close. Zahara remained seated, her fingers still gripping the phone as if it were the only solid thing in the room. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The entire trial had felt like a well-rehearsed play, orchestrated to lead to one inevitable conclusion: her conviction. The judge had been in control, the prosecutor had been smug, the jury had seemed convinced. But now, the script had been ripped apart in real time. A ripple of confusion spread through the courtroom. Jurors exchanged uncertain glances. The prosecutor, Brandon Teller, who had spent the last 2 weeks painting Zahara as a criminal mastermind, was suddenly flipping through his files with an urgency that reeked of desperation. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, waiting for a command that no longer seemed clear. Even the officer who had been prepared to place her in cuffs took a hesitant step back, his confidence shaken. Judge Everett Langford cleared his throat and lifted his gavel, but for the first time that day, his presence didn't silence the room. Enough. This court is in recess. Everyone is to vacate the premises immediately. His voice, usually a sharp blade, now had a frayed edge. He was stalling, buying time to figure out what had just happened. Zahara turned slightly as her attorney, Miriam Cole, leaned in. A seasoned defense lawyer with years of experience, Miriam was rarely rattled. But now, she looked genuinely stunned. "What the hell did your husband just say to him?" Her voice was hushed, but there was an urgency beneath it. Zahara's mind raced. She had no idea what Cassius had told Langford, but she knew her husband. Cassius Hawthorne was not a man who bluffed. He didn't threaten without leverage, and if Langford had been willing to railroad her, that meant Cassius had uncovered something serious, something that could end him. Zahara's grip on the phone tightened. Whatever it was, it worked. Langford abruptly stood, his robe billowing slightly as he moved. He stormed toward his chambers, his expression stiff with controlled fury. As he passed Zahara's table, his eyes flicked to hers for a fraction of a second. And in that instant, she saw it. Not just anger. Not just frustration. Fear. He knew he had been caught. The only question now was how much Cassius knew, and how far he was willing to go. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as people slowly rose from their seats. Jurors whispered amongst themselves, while the court reporters packed up their equipment with wary glances. Teller, the prosecutor, remained frozen for a few beats longer before finally snapping his briefcase shut. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the vein in his temple bulged. When his eyes met Zahara's, there was something dark behind them. This wasn't over, not for him. Miriam grabbed her briefcase, motioning toward the exit. "Let's go before they change their minds." Zahara nodded, forcing her legs to move even as the adrenaline made them feel unsteady. She walked past the prosecutor's table, feeling his gaze burning into her back. Every instinct in her body told her that something bigger was at play, that this was just the beginning of something far more dangerous. As she stepped out into the courthouse hallway, she spotted a tall figure standing near the grand double doors. He was dressed in a dark, perfectly tailored suit, his posture relaxed yet commanding. The moment her eyes met his, she felt a wave of calm wash over her. Cassius was here, and whatever storm had started in that courtroom, he was here to finish it. The courthouse hallway was cavernous, the polished marble floors reflecting the fluorescent lights above. Voices echoed distantly as reporters and legal clerks whispered among themselves, their curiosity palpable. But Zahara barely noticed them. Her eyes were locked on the man standing near the grand entrance, his presence commanding yet unreadable. Cassius Hawthorne wasn't a man who blended into a crowd. His sharp navy blue suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted. He radiated power, not the kind that came from wealth or prestige alone, but the kind earned through ruthless precision and unwavering control. He was the law when it suited him, and the executioner when it didn't. As Zahara stepped forward, her heartbeat slowed, not out of fear, but out of certainty. Cassius was here, which meant this was far from over. Miriam, still gripping her briefcase, exhaled sharply beside her. Hawthorne showing up in person? This is about to get messy. She wasn't wrong. Cassius never arrived quietly. Wherever he went, battle lines were drawn, and opponents were crushed beneath the weight of his influence. Before Zahara could respond, Cassius strode forward with deliberate steps, his dark eyes scanning her face, reading her like an open case file. He reached for her hand, his grip firm, grounding her amidst the chaos. "Are you hurt?" His voice was measured, controlled, but there was an undercurrent of something lethal beneath it. "No. But they tried." Zahara's voice was steady, but Cassius caught the flicker of exhaustion in her gaze. His jaw tightened. He turned his attention to Miriam. Who was the prosecutor? Miriam barely hesitated. Brandon Teller. And Langford presided over the case. It was a setup from the beginning. Cassius's expression didn't change, but Zahara knew him well enough to recognize the shift, the calculation happening in real time. Teller and Langford had just made the most dangerous mistake of their careers. They underestimated the wrong man's wife. A sharp click of heels against marble interrupted them. Brandon Teller. The prosecutor was approaching, his suit stiff, his expression schooled into neutrality, but the flicker of irritation in his eyes betrayed him. Attorney General Hawthorne. "I didn't expect to see you here." Cassius turned slowly, his gaze locking onto Teller's with the cold precision of a marksman lining up a shot. "Clearly, or you wouldn't have been so reckless." The air between them crackled with tension. The hallway seemed smaller, suffocating. This wasn't just a legal dispute anymore. This was a war. And Zahara, standing between them, knew one thing for certain. Someone was about to lose. Badly. For a moment, no one moved. The hallway, once filled with murmurs and the distant shuffle of paperwork, had gone silent. It was as if the weight of two titans colliding had sucked the oxygen from the air. Zahara could feel the tension tightening around them, an invisible rope pulling taut between Cassius Hawthorne and Brandon Teller. The prosecutor squared his shoulders, slipping his hands into his pockets, a feigned act of control. "You're making quite the entrance, Attorney General. Most husbands don't show up to personally oversee their wives' convictions." His voice carried the same smug arrogance he had wielded in the courtroom, but there was something different now. A waver, just beneath the surface. He was rattled. Cassius didn't blink. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if assessing a specimen beneath a microscope. Calculating. Silent. Deadly. Then, with a voice as smooth as glass but as sharp as a razor, he said, "Most prosecutors don't fabricate evidence and call it justice." Teller's smirk faltered, but only for a fraction of a second. "That's a bold accusation. You have proof." Cassius let the question hang in the air, the ghost of a smirk touching the corner of his lips. He didn't need to answer. The power shift was happening in real time, and everyone in that hallway knew it. Teller had walked in thinking he was still in control. Now he was realizing he had stepped onto a battlefield without armor. Miriam, ever the strategist, took a step forward, her tone clipped and professional. "The court just recessed an active sentencing. That alone tells me you and Langford have a serious problem. and judging by the way he nearly sprinted to his chambers, I'd say he already knows it. Teller's jaw flexed, his irritation bubbling beneath the surface. Your client is still guilty. A recess doesn't erase the evidence. Cassius finally moved, stepping just close enough that his presence became a tangible force. ***, you really want to talk about evidence? Fine. Let's talk about the fabricated witness statements. The anonymous tip that conveniently led to my wife's arrest. The financial records that, according to my forensic team, don't exist. Zahara saw it, the way Teller's eyes flickered, the microsecond of panic before he regained his mask. But it was too late. Cassius had already seen it too. He had him. You have no jurisdiction here, Hawthorne. This case was handled by the state, not the DOJ. Teller's voice was tight now, defensive. Cassius smiled. It was not a reassuring smile. Oh, Brandon. You know that's not how this works. The moment you crossed the line, you made it my jurisdiction. And let me make something very clear, this isn't just about my wife anymore. This is about you and how deep this corruption runs. Because I will find out. Teller inhaled sharply, but before he could retaliate, the doors to Judge Langford's chambers swung open with a bang. All heads turned as the man himself emerged, his face ashen, his lips pressed into a thin line. He was gripping a folder, his hands slightly unsteady. Something had changed in that room. Zahara's stomach twisted. What the hell had Cassius done? Langford's gaze flickered toward Cassius, then Teller. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Then, in a voice that lacked its usual ironclad authority, he said, "We need to talk. Now." Cassius turned back to Teller, his expression unreadable. "Looks like your day just got worse." The war had officially begun. Judge Everett Langford stood in the doorway of his chambers, gripping the folder so tightly that his fingers were pale. The man who had once commanded the courtroom with ease now looked like he had seen a ghost. The hallway remained eerily silent, all eyes locked onto him. Whatever was in that folder, it had shaken him to his core. Cassius Hawthorne didn't move at first. He let the tension stretch, watching Langford with the patience of a predator sizing up its wounded prey. Then, with a measured step, he broke the silence. "I assume you finally have something worth discussing." His voice was calm, but Zahara knew better. Underneath that controlled exterior, Cassius was already dismantling Langford piece by piece in his mind. Langford inhaled sharply before speaking. "My chambers. Now." His voice lacked its usual dominance. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. Cassius turned to Zahara, brushing his fingers lightly over the back of her hand in a silent message. "Stay close, don't trust anyone." Then, without another word, he strode past Langford into the judge's chambers. Zahara and Miriam exchanged a glance before following. Teller hesitated. For the first time, the once confident prosecutor looked unsure. He didn't want to go in that room, but he also knew that not going would be an admission of guilt. So, with a tight jaw, he followed. The heavy door shut behind them, sealing the four of them inside. The air was thick with tension. Langford's office was as grand as expected. Mahogany shelves lined with law books, an expensive whiskey decanter untouched on the desk, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was the folder clutched in Langford's trembling hands. Cassius leaned against the desk, his presence effortlessly dominating the room. "What did you find, Judge?" Langford hesitated. His fingers twitched over the folder's edge. "I need assurances." Cassius let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "Assurances? You tried to send my wife to prison for a decade, and now you want assurances." He pushed off the desk, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "Here's the only assurance I'll give you. If you don't start talking in the next 10 seconds, I'll make sure you and Teller here are cellmates before the week is over." Teller stiffened. You can't. Cassius cut him off with a glare so sharp it could have sliced through steel. Try me. Langford exhaled shakily and finally placed the folder on the desk. With reluctant hands, he flipped it open, revealing a stack of documents, bank records, transcripts, wire transfers. Zahara leaned in, her breath catching as she skimmed the pages. It was all there. Money funneled into offshore accounts. A pattern of rigged cases. Bribes disguised as campaign donations. And at the center of it all, Brandon Teller's name. Zahara's stomach turned. They weren't just trying to frame her. They had done this before. To others. Miriam let out a low whistle. Well, looks like someone's been busy. Teller's face went pale. This is fabricated. There's no way. Langford's voice cracked. It's real. I double-checked. It all traces back to you. He turned to Cassius, desperation creeping into his expression. You wanted the truth? There it is. But I can't go down for this. I was pushed into it. I was given orders. Cassius arched a brow. By who? Langford hesitated. His gaze flickered to Teller. The silence stretched long enough that Zahara's skin prickled. Then, finally, Langford exhaled. You're not thinking big enough, Hawthorne. This goes higher than me. Higher than him. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. You're not fighting one corrupt judge or a dirty prosecutor. You're standing in the middle of something bigger than you realize. And if you keep pushing, he swallowed hard, they will come for you. Cassius didn't blink. He had expected this. Let them. Langford closed his eyes for a moment, defeated. Then he slid the folder toward Cassius. You didn't get this from me. And after today, I never want to see you again. Cassius smirked. Oh, Judge. After today, you won't. Teller shot up from his chair, his panic barely restrained. This is a trap. This doesn't prove anything. You think you can take this and just... Cassius grabbed the folder and turned toward the door, cutting him off. Brandon, you should really stop talking. You're just making my job easier. And with that, he strode out of the office, Zahara and Miriam following close behind. As the door shut behind them, Zahara exhaled, adrenaline still pulsing through her veins. What now? Cassius glanced down at the folder in his hands. His jaw tightened. Then, after a beat, he met her gaze. Now? We burn it all down. The drive back was silent, but the air inside the black SUV crackled with unspoken tension. Zahara sat in the passenger seat, her pulse still racing, her fingers curled tightly around her lap. Beside her, Cassius gripped the steering wheel with one hand, the other resting over the thick folder of damning evidence on the center console. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, but neither of them was paying attention to the world outside. In the back seat, Miriam Cole was the first to break the silence. I don't like this. Her voice was sharp, but there was an undercurrent of something else, concern. This isn't just some rogue prosecutor cutting corners to boost his conviction rate. We're talking about a systemic operation. If Langford was willing to roll over this easily, it means he knows what happens to people who don't. Zahara exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. She knew Miriam was right. This wasn't just a case of judicial corruption. This was something bigger. Something designed. And if Langford had been nothing more than a pawn, then the Real King was still out there, watching, waiting. Cassius didn't take his eyes off the road. That's exactly why we're not walking away. His voice was controlled, but Zahara could hear the fury simmering beneath it. He had spent his career dismantling corrupt systems, but this was personal. They had come for his wife. Miriam scoffed, shaking her head. And what's your plan, Hawthorne? Take this straight to the press? Call in a few favors at the DOJ? Cassius finally glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his gaze sharp. "No. We go to the source. We cut off the head of the snake." Zahara frowned, shifting in her seat. "And who exactly is the head?" Cassius hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Zahara to notice. Then, finally, he spoke. "Teller isn't just a prosecutor. He's a fixer. He buries cases, protects certain people. And those people, they're the ones pulling the strings." Miriam leaned forward, her elbows resting on the back of their seats. "Then we need leverage. Real leverage." She gestured to the folder on the console. "This is good, but it's not enough. You want to take down the people behind Teller? We need someone inside. Someone who knows exactly how deep this runs." Zahara's mind raced. An insider. Someone with direct knowledge of the operation. Someone who wanted out. She swallowed hard, then whispered, "Langford was scared. If he was taking orders, then there are others. People like him. We just have to find the right one." Cassius nodded, a slow smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "I already have someone in mind." Miriam raised a brow. "And do they know they're about to flip?" Cassius's smirk deepened. He reached for his phone and dialed a number, holding it to his ear. After a few rings, a voice answered. Deep, cautious, uncertain. "Cassius, why the hell are you calling me?" Zahara stiffened. Who was this? Cassius leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "Because, Senator, I think it's time we talk about the people you've been protecting." There was a beat of silence. Then, the line went dead. Miriam let out a slow whistle. "You just love playing with fire, don't you?" Cassius smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No. I just love watching it burn." And in that moment, Zahara knew, this wasn't just about justice anymore. This was war. Senator Clayton Monroe sat stiffly behind his desk, his fingers drumming against the polished wood. His office smelled of old cigars and power, but for the first time, he wasn't the one in control. Across from him, Cassius Hawthorne sat calmly, the folder of damning evidence resting on his lap. Zahara stood by the window, arms crossed, while Miriam leaned casually against a bookshelf, watching Monroe with quiet amusement. Monroe exhaled through his nose. Asterisk, you're making a mistake, Hawthorne. Langford and Teller? They're small players. The people behind them, they don't tolerate betrayal. His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed him, tapping nervously. Cassius didn't flinch. "Then it's a shame they picked the wrong person to frame." He tapped the folder. "You're either on the right side of this, or you go down with them. Your choice." For a long moment, Monroe said nothing. Then, with a resigned sigh, he reached into a locked drawer and pulled out a second folder, thicker, heavier. He hesitated before sliding it across the desk. Cassius flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. But Zahara saw the shift in his eyes. This was worse than they thought. Monroe leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You don't understand what you've started. You think you're in control? The moment you expose this, you'll have enemies you can't see coming." Cassius closed the folder and stood, his smirk cold. "Then they should start running now." The black SUV cut through the dimly lit streets, the weight of Senator Monroe's files pressing down on everyone inside. Zahara sat rigidly in the passenger seat, her fingers tapping against her thigh in an uneven rhythm. Beside her, Cassius drove in silence, his jaw tight, his focus razor-sharp. In the back seat, Miriam flipped through the pages of the second folder, her expression hardening with every line she read. "This isn't just about one corrupt trial," she muttered, flipping to another page. "This is an entire machine. Judges, prosecutors, law enforcement, even members of Congress. Rigged convictions, money laundering, coercion, disappearances. She looked up, meeting Cassius's eyes in the rearview mirror. You take this public, and you're not just exposing a few dirty officials, you're detonating a bomb at the highest levels. Cassius didn't hesitate. Good. Let them burn. His voice was low, measured, but Zahara could hear the controlled rage beneath it. This wasn't just a legal fight anymore. It was personal. They had tried to take his wife, to ruin her life, to bury her under a lie. Now, he was prepared to bury them first. His phone buzzed. Without looking, he put it on speaker. A deep, unfamiliar voice filled the car. You have no idea what you just did, Hawthorne. Drop this. Walk away. You don't want this fight. Cassius let out a quiet chuckle, one hand tightening on the wheel. Or what? His voice carried no fear, only cold amusement. The line went dead. A second later, headlights flared in the rearview mirror. Too bright, too close. Then, from the tinted window of the trailing car, the unmistakable glint of a gun barrel emerged. They weren't just sending a warning. They were making their move. Cassius yanked the wheel hard, the SUV skidding as the first gunshot shattered the rear windshield. Glass sprayed through the car, but Zahara ducked instinctively, heart pounding. Miriam cursed, grabbing her gun from the glove compartment as Cassius straightened the vehicle, accelerating. The black sedan behind them didn't hesitate. Another shot rang out, slamming into the trunk. The engine roared as Cassius took a sharp turn down a side street, the tires screeching. Zahara's pulse hammered in her ears. This wasn't intimidation. This was an execution. We need to end this now. Miriam shouted, rolling down the window and taking aim. The muzzle flash from their pursuers lit up the night, but Miriam fired first. 1, 2, 3 shots. The sedan swerved but didn't stop. Whoever they weren't amateurs. Cassius's eyes flicked to the GPS. They were minutes from a secure DOJ safe house. If they could hold out. But then, another car appeared ahead, blocking the road. A trap. Zahara's stomach clenched. They had planned this. Cassius didn't slow down. Instead, he whispered, "Hold on." He hit the gas. The SUV barreled forward, straight toward the blockade. At the last second, Cassius jerked the wheel, clipping the edge of the parked car and sending their SUV into a spin. The impact rocked them, metal screeching, but they kept moving. Barely. Behind them, sirens wailed. Cassius smirked. Right on time. The convoy of black SUVs with government plates flooded the streets. FBI. Cassius had made a call before they left Monroe's office. The trap had been flipped on its makers. The sedan behind them tried to turn. Too late. Armed agents swarmed the vehicles, dragging men out, pinning them to the pavement. It was over. Zahara exhaled sharply, hands trembling. Cassius reached over, gripping hers tightly. "You're safe." They lost. Miriam let out a breathless laugh. "Damn. That was one hell of a gamble." Cassius smirked. "I don't gamble. I plan." Zahara turned, looking back at the chaos behind them. The men who had tried to kill her were in cuffs. Langford and Teller would fall next. This wasn't just survival. This was victory.